Hello, everybody. Good evening to you all. Hope everybody is doing well tonight. I would like to welcome you to PowerScore's Law School Admissions 101 webinar. My name is Dave Killorn, and some of you know me as the author of the LSAT Bibles, and some of you know me from the PowerScore LSAT podcast. So hopefully you're familiar with what we do, but if not, we hope that this will give you a sense of how we like to approach things and the nature of how we talk about the law school admissions process. So the real big question here is, what is this seminar going to cover? And this is a very general overview of how the law school admissions process works. So we're going to look at the timeline, we're going to look at the important players in the process, and then we're going to look at some very specific scenarios, such as non-traditional applicants and so forth. Aside from myself who will be talking tonight, we've got a couple different people in the room. First and foremost is John Denning, my podcast co-host, someone that many of you actually know as well. And also with me and co-hosting this seminar tonight is Jay Donnell, who is one of our ACE LSAT instructors, but even more so, an incredibly knowledgeable admissions consultant here. And so he and I are going to split up the discussion tonight and talk about all these different questions. So on that note, can you ask questions? And the answer is yes, you can. There are going to be a couple different ways to do that, but the primary channel is in the lower left-hand side, and that is our chat channel down there. So you can type questions in there, and when I'm talking, both Jay and John will be there to talk a little bit about the ideas that you're asking about and to give you answers. And when Jay's on the microphone, I will be going ahead and answering questions there. So please feel free to ask us anything that you think is relevant here. I'm not sure we can get to all the questions, but we will do our best to get through everything. And then at the very end of the seminar, once we've closed out the content that we'd really like to cover and make sure that everybody is familiar with, we will usually jump on the microphone and take questions live, where we can explain it as kind of a post-seminar section. So if you have specific questions that you want to hold until then, certainly feel free to do so, and we just kind of go through the list and try to answer as many as we possibly can, and to give as complete as answers as we possibly are able to do. So with that kind of covered, the introductory ideas, let's dive into the seminar and start talking and learning about the process of applying to law school. And to me, one of the key questions that you can get asked here is, what and who are law schools looking for? And a lot of times what happens is that students have the wrong idea. They have a very specific vision of what a lawyer is, and they think that law schools are looking for that person over and over. And it's really important to consider whether or not this is true, because if you go into the process thinking just about what you think a lawyer is supposed to look like and what a law student is supposed to look like, that is really going to send you down the wrong path. Instead, what you want to consider is, what do you think law schools want? Who are they looking for to round out their class? So don't think about it from your perspective, but think about it from the perspective of the law schools. It's their decision. They're the ones who are actually making the choices and assembling a class. And so to look at it through their lens is incredibly helpful. Now, a lot of times people think there's an ideal or a perfect law school applicant. And I've seen some perfect applicants, things where everything was bulletproof. But there really is no such thing as one perfect ideal. There are many different types of ideal law school applicants. And whenever I talk about this idea with law schools, what I like to kind of focus on is the idea that it's not just one person, but a team. That a class is really kind of like a big sports team, to me at least, where you don't want the same type of person over and over again. What you really want is people from a variety of different backgrounds, different walks of life, and different approaches to thinking. That could be different politics, it could be different types of religion, it could be all sorts of different things. But the key thing is to realize there's not just one thing that is out there. Kind of the analogy that I'll sometimes use is, if you were making a football team, Would you want to have a team of 60 quarterbacks? No, you wouldn't. That would be a very bad football team. It would be a great set of quarterbacks, I'm sure, and they could really throw the ball, but there'd be no one to block, there'd be no one to catch, there'd be no defense. And you can apply that to all sorts of different type of sports analogies. If you were making a baseball team, you wouldn't want to have a whole team full of pitchers. There'd be no hitters, and the fielding wouldn't be that good for the most part. So when you think about that, from the perspective of who law schools are looking for, they're looking for someone to fit different places in the class. That means different viewpoints and different backgrounds. And that means that someone else might have a lot of great traits, but they may not have the traits that you have. And if you can play those strengths and traits up to the law school, you are able to make an appealing case that you should be included in the class as well. Now, when schools look at applicants straight up, and they just consider them in a really broad sense, without figuring where they fit into the class, what they're really looking for is two things. And the first is kind of like an academic potential. And this is where your numbers come into play. As we'll talk about the GPA and LSAT a little bit, the first thing that law schools want to make sure they understand is, can you succeed here? Can you do well? And from that question, they want to see your LSAT score. They want to see how you did in undergraduate and graduate school. They want to look at your GPA and your transcripts. They're going to look at your recommendations and see what people actually say about you. And I always think about that as like the harder number side of things. What they're trying to determine at that point is, can this person succeed here? Because that's a very important question, especially as you go higher and higher on the rankings list. They do not like to see people leave law school. They do not want to see any type of attrition. They want 100% retention, and that's considered a sign of a really good school when everybody who starts off and matriculates ends up graduating. And the other thing is the idea of diversity. And this does play a little bit more with the kind of like assembling that team. But the word diversity is something that if you haven't really been around the law school process, you may not completely understand. Diversity has been defined in a very narrow way in a lot of cases by the general public. But in law schools, that's not quite how it works. Diversity can be any of a number of factors. For example, age. Applicants who apply after the age of, say, 40 or 50 are rather rare, and they bring diversity to the class. And if you think about it, the typical applicant is somewhere in their mid-20s. Would you want every student in a law school class to be age 25? No, they'd all have a really similar view. So you add people who are maybe a little bit older, and it changes the view. And this can be a diversity factor of which there are many, geographical, political, and so forth. So as you look at these types of things, they are looking for variation in their applicants, and they're looking for your ability to perform well. And as I often say, those two things combine to the broader question, which is, not only are you going to succeed in law school, but are you going to succeed in life thereafter? Are you going to go out into the general public after you're done in your law school career and make an impact and to reflect well back on them? That you could be a public defender who's really well known, and they would be thrilled with that. You could be a big firm partner, a big law person who practices for years and years. They'd be thrilled with that. You could be a politician. All those things are great in their eyes. They just want people who are doing things, making things happen. And that's something Jay will touch on a little bit later. But for now, just keep that in mind as a point of importance here. They're looking to see if you're going to go out and do well by them and reflect back on their name. Now, if we know that's what they're looking for, the whole process then comes down to following the rules. And the rules are built around the law school application timeline. So let's just briefly talk about that so everybody's clear on where we are. And one of the reasons we scheduled this particular webinar for the middle of September is we're right at the start of the process. And I know that many of the people who are listening tonight are thinking, I don't know much about this. So please help me understand, what I'm going to have to go through, all the hoops I have to jump through, and so forth. And that's what our goal is. Well, first off, nobody is late in the process at this point. Typically, applications will become available right around now in September and October. So you should see some out now. There's still some more coming, but this is the beginning of the window. The next set of deadlines that you're going to run into are going to be the early decision and admissions deadlines. And these typically start rolling into November and say December 1st. And I will talk about early decision at the end of the seminar and the pluses and minuses of early decision and early action and so forth. So we'll come back to that one a little bit later. And then most of the regular decision deadlines are sometime in January or February, and these days it stretches out past April into May and sometimes June and July. But most of them are taken care of by May. And one of the things that we have seen is that the pandemic changed application timelines a little bit. It caused schools to move things back and be a lot more lenient. And even in the last 4, 5, 6 years, we have seen the law school admissions process become longer and elongated. It used to be that everybody wanted all the school information by January 15th or February 15th. And then law schools began to realize that they were making the window too short. So some schools added March, then April and May. There were some schools that we talked to last year that were willing to accept applications all the way into August. And I'm not talking about schools that are way down the so-called rankings list, but schools that were, say, in the top 50. So one of the things that's important is to talk to the schools that you're applying to and to determine from them, hey, when's the best time to apply? They will all say it's early, as we'll discuss in just a moment, but they will also tell you, okay, you can go ahead and take the February LSAT and you'd be fine, or you can take a later LSAT, or you could apply as late as, say, May 1st. So make sure you don't miss deadlines because it is proven that law schools do not like that. They tend to get a little bit upset about that. Now, all things being equal, if you can, try to apply earlier as opposed to later. And that is because, unlike a lot of undergraduate schools, most law schools, if not all of them, use what is known as a rolling admissions process. And if you've never encountered this process before, it's worth understanding how it works. And so I'll talk a little bit about it right now, and then I'll talk a little bit about some of the misconceptions about it. But what a rolling admissions process means is that as the applications come in, they get batched into groups. Might be 10, might be 25, depends on the school. And then they get sent out for immediate processing, which means that right now there are law schools in this country that are already reading applications. Now, don't get nervous. If you're like, what? I'm way far behind? No. Even by the time we reach January 1st, we won't even have 50% of the applicants that we're going to get overall in the pipeline. So anything this side of the holidays is actually relatively early in the process. But schools will start reading applications immediately. And the reason they do this is fairly simple. If they were to wait and hold them all until, say, like January 15th, the workload would be outrageous. They'd be hating life. They wouldn't want to deal with it. And so it's better to start early and do it consistently and constantly throughout the process, as opposed to trying to let it all build up like a big dam. And for those of you who are familiar with the LSAT writing situation, that's what they've done. They've got so many to process, they can't get through it all. Law schools want to avoid that. So instead, they do it slowly but surely. Now, what this means is that you can start to see admissions decisions within, say, 2 months of applying to law schools. That does not mean that every person will get a decision within 2 months. And the timelines really do vary from school to school. But you have some students out there who will apply in September and they will start finding out by mid to late November, okay, this is what one of my options is or isn't, depending upon the result they get. Now, just because some people will get answers relatively soon does not mean that everybody will. Sometimes you apply early and nothing really happens. They just sit on your application, which I will tell you right now, when you get to March or April, is incredibly frustrating because you want an answer. You want to know what's going on with your life, but the schools do it according to their preferences. So as you go through this, be prepared to wait at times. It may very well be that you apply early and you don't get an answer for months and months, or you might apply late and get an answer very quickly. It just really depends on how the school is shaping things up. And this is one of the problems with rolling admissions, is that they're making decisions and analysis early on, but one of the big impact factors in what happens to each student is how the class as a whole shapes up. So sometimes classes will appear and they'll have really high LSAT averages or really high GPA averages, or they'll have a lot of people with one particular skill or trait, and that will impact the people who come later. And that's neither good nor bad. That can be beneficial to you, or it might be adverse to you. It really depends, and there is no way to predict it. But as they go through this process, one of the things that's often been said is that if you apply earlier, you have an advantage. That is true. However, it's a limited advantage. As we've often said to people, just applying early does not mean that you get this gigantic boost. It is a small boost because they're able to consider you early on, and at that point, they have the greatest number of spaces available. And then as time goes on, they have fewer spaces available and, of course, more applicants. But it is not going to take someone who has, is below all the medians and doesn't have a great application and all of a sudden vault them into contention at a school. The early applications are most useful for people who would be really close regardless and have hit the medians, and then law schools will turn around and say, every other year we'd admit this person, so let's go ahead and do it right now while we have the room, and maybe we can get them to lock in early. But one of the things that is really key, as we will see, is that your LSAT and GPA play a huge role. You can't affect your GPA at this point. You often can affect your LSAT score. And so while applying early is a benefit, it is actually better to apply later with a higher LSAT score, because the LSAT score is what the law school has to report for rankings in the ABA and so forth. So rolling admissions is something that has already started. If you can apply early, you want to apply early. However, if your application isn't ready, or if you think you can get a higher LSAT score, then relax, focus on that, and apply later. Better to apply later with a better application than earlier with one that is, I'm not going to say deficient, but subpar to what your potential actually is. So how about applications? Every year we do this, and I'm sure Jay can second this for me. We see students come in who say, all right, I'm going to put my application together this week and then send it out. And as I always say, I'm like, that's not going to happen. And you feel like, well, it's just paperwork for the most part. If you have all the pieces, you should be able to do that. That is not how it works. Usually it takes several months to complete an application. And Jay's going to go through some of the pieces that we have in the process, as will I. But keep this in mind. There's a lot of moving parts. And so it can take some time. You're going to have to talk to other people, like your school, to get your transcripts. You're going to have to talk to letters of recommendation. All these different elements will come up soon, but it's not something you can do quickly. And that's true also for your personal statement. I worked in the past with a lot of students doing their personal statement, and they would write a draft, we would go through it, and I'd say, don't come back to me with a draft for 4 or 5 days. I want you to think about it. And they'd return 2 hours later with a new draft. And I'd say, that's not going to work. This is not a fast food situation. This is gourmet dining, and you have to take your time putting everything together. So plan out for extra time in the process. If you can, though, try and submit everything once you have it all available and it matches your expectations. That's the key thing. Don't rush. Get it right is the most important thing. And then, interestingly enough, and this is news to a lot of people who first are getting into the law school process, it is a sad, in my opinion, but true fact that your LSAT score, along with your GPA, actually have the greatest impact on where you will be able to get into schools. That's a numbers game, and that is because they have to report all their averages and medians to the American Bar Association. And then the U.S. News and World Report comes in and takes all that information and starts churning out rankings. And the ranking a school has a huge impact on the number of applicants it gets, the quality of the applicants it's able to retain. So it is important to have a great personal statement. It's important to have a great letter of recommendation and to have everything line up the way that it should. But the starting point for all these discussions is your LSAT score and your GPA. So GPA, hard to affect. LSAT, as we often talk about in other seminars, is something that you still can change and something that you really should focus on. So let's take a look at all the different pieces that we have of the standard law school application. First off, an application form. There's always an application form, whether you're dealing with schools, or the government, or the DMV, you name it. And usually this is just a bunch of standard information, such as your name, your address, your history, all those kinds of things. You're going to need an LSAT score. Some schools will accept the GRE, but not all of them. Interesting fact that somebody asked me earlier today is, I've taken the LSAT, and now I'm thinking of taking the GRE. Maybe one day that'll work, but currently, if you apply to law school with both an LSAT score and a GRE score, the law schools are obligated to use just your LSAT score, and they will ignore your GRE. So a GRE score is only useful if you've never taken the LSAT. You're going to need a personal statement. A personal statement is an essay you write talking about yourself. It doesn't have to be about why you want to go to law school. It just has to show something about you. And I did a great seminar a couple of years ago about writing a personal statement and what law schools are looking for. And hopefully, John can link that for us here so that we're able to kind of like, if you want to at a later time, take a look at that particular webinar. But it goes through how to actually write one and really how to frame it so a law school becomes interested. And I have a feeling Jay, who is a personal statement master, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. You're going to need a resume, which is weird for some people. This isn't a job that I'm applying for. Yeah, but it's become a standard part of the process. And as I always caution people, unless you are Elon Musk, don't make it 2 pages. Make it 1 page. Most people don't have enough meat in the resume to get past 1 page. You better have started a bunch of companies and been on the cover of Fortune 500 if you're going to go on multiple pages. And then you're going to need letters of recommendation, typically 2, sometimes 3. At least one of those will need to be academic. So that if you're in school or recently out of school, that's the case. If you have been in the workforce for, say, a decade, it's understood that going back to a professor from 10 years ago isn't going to be useful. And so in that case, you'd need somebody who's a direct supervisor to write something like that. And usefully enough, I did a letters of recommendation webinar a while back that covers how to go about getting recommenders, who to choose, what to have them write about, how to help them do the best possible job. And so hopefully we can toss that link up as well. You're also going to need copies of your undergraduate, and not just your main undergraduate, but any undergraduate institution where you took classes, whether that was a community college or whether that was just a one-off somewhere. And then any graduate school transcripts. I will say this about undergraduate GPA versus graduate GPA. Sadly, your graduate GPA is not going to count for a whole lot in the process. It's great that you have a graduate degree if you have one, and congratulations on that. It's a plus. But if you had a 3.1 undergraduate GPA and then a 4.0 graduate GPA, they simply don't weigh the 4.0 with much, they don't give it much credence at all. And that is for 2 reasons, because not everybody has a graduate degree, so it's not a fair comparison. And then there is a widespread belief that in most graduate schools, GPAs are dramatically inflated. So they'll say, yeah, you've got a 4.0, but everybody had a 4.0 at that school or something close to it. I'm not saying that's fair. I'm just saying I've heard that so many times that it's now to me taken as law as far as that goes. So those are the main pieces that you would actually run into. However, those aren't the only pieces that you will see. There's also optional documents. So sometimes there's more than just a personal statement. There'll be additional essays you can write, like Yale has famous Why Yale kind of thing, or write a 250 page or 250 word essay about any topic of your choice. Or why do you want to go to this school? Or add something about the diversity that you'll bring to the class. We like to say that optional really means recommended, that if you can do it, do it. If you have to really stretch to find something, then maybe don't, because it'll be pretty obvious. But for the most part, optional really isn't optional. It's something that you should really be trying to do. They might need supplemental biographical information, some additional records or transcripts or statements of some sort. You might need dean's certification from your undergraduate institution. And you might need to add an addendum. And this is a topic that we could probably turn into an entire seminar on its own. But an addendum can be incredibly useful to deal with very specific issues, which are often problems. For example, if you had a really bad semester at school, you might use an addendum to explain that. Maybe someone in your family got sick and you had to go tend and care to them. And if that's the case, that would be a really good thing for the law schools to understand that, this person had a bunch of 3 9s and 4 O's, and then they had a 2 9. They're going to naturally ask, well, what happened? And addendums are great for answering the question of why did this occur? Or maybe you had a really low LSAT score, even though you took it several times, and you can talk about why testing and standardized testing really isn't indicative of your ability. Or maybe you were arrested at some point, and that's on your record and you had to disclose it. Perhaps you can talk about that and explain why, that was a youthful mistake or not what it seemed to be. But addenda are great at addressing those types of problematic elements. So if you have a problematic element in your past, consider this as an additional type of essay that you could add into your application to explain a problem. And the last point down here, my favorite, because it's almost like an LSAT piece of advice, make sure to read everything and read it carefully and don't miss anything. One of the worst things that can happen is you think your application is 100% ready to go, and then you discover that it is not. So, at least as far as that, just make sure you've checked every single box. And as Jay will talk about, this requires a lot of organization. And so, to kind of handle that, I'm going to hand the mic over to Jay and let him talk a little bit about some of the big players in this process. Jay, all yours, buddy.
All right. Thank you, Dave, and hello, everybody. My name is Jay Donnell, and I'm excited to be here tonight. And so my job is to walk us through the next several pages here involving the actual logistical elements of how you physically apply to law school. So you guys are very aware of the acronym LSAT being the law school admission test. However, the LSAC or LSAC is a very major player. And so the LSAC, if you haven't seen it already, www.lsac.org, is a website that's going to take a lot of your time, a lot of your stress, and a lot of your money. However, it is the main thoroughfare in which you actually send off your applications to law school. And the engine that runs the particular process here is what's called the Credential Assembly Service, or CAS. And so I'm going to try to focus on the screen and keep my eyeballs off the chat for a minute to keep focused, but likely some of you guys have already met the Credential Assembly Service. It is a mandatory part of the process. It allows you to facilitate the actual process of applying, and here's the kinds of things that it helps you actually do. And so this allows you to then apply to any U.S., ABA-approved law school, almost exclusively electronically. Some schools may still offer the opportunity to apply via paper, but do not do this. It's harder for you. Schools don't like it. It's not going to give you an advantage. So you apply via the LSAC website, that portal, and this is the system that organizes the mechanics. And so this is where you find the applications. This is where you actually build them. This is where you submit all the relevant documents, the kinds of things I'm going to start to clear up here. So these things, the essays, which include things we've mentioned already, personal statement, diversity statement, addenda, particularly school-specific statements like the Yale fun facts, the Columbia short statements, Georgetown's funky optional things. They also allow you to usefully process your letters of recommendation, and maybe most importantly for the sort of strictly academic side, the transcripts. And so there's going to be a few things I'll mention in a couple of minutes about what an academic summary report is. I saw a question a few minutes ago about what the intricacies are of accumulating your GPA and having that match the LSAT system in comparison to all of your competition. So this is your information clearinghouse, right? It aggregates all of your data and it puts it into a streamlined format called a law school report. Right? Law schools are not sent all of your bits and pieces individually. They are sent them collectively, smoothly through this law school report. So these are the things that are the major players within then that law school report, which is essentially your actual progression of your application. So this right here, the academic summary report, which is the LSAC standardized version of your undergraduate transcript or transcripts. And so I had a question earlier. Somebody had asked about a study abroad program, but it was organized through your undergraduate institution. Likely, that wouldn't have to have a separate transcript grabbed from your foreign institution, but it's always important to double check with your actual undergraduate school's transcript office. And so here's what happens. I want to give you guys a heads up about this. The GPA that you currently see through your school's website or your accessible transcripts may not be the exact same GPA that your future law schools are going to see. The reason why is that there are so many institutions across the country that do things each a little bit differently. Some schools will play with different grading systems for pluses and minuses. Some schools rank what happens as you withdraw from a class, repeat a class, a little bit differently than others. The LSAC machine, through the Credential Assembly Services, has their own algorithm, which allows them to aggregate all of your data and can input it through their major system so that you have a LSAC version of your GPA, and that's what schools are going to see. So for many students, I might safely say the majority of students, the GPA that you see through your LSAC portal may be a little bit lower than what you see now, but there are some students who see a boost. But just know that what happens to your GPA happens to literally everybody's, and it's a major part of their streamlining system. And so I do also want to share a quick vignette of a bit of a horror story that I had to undergo. So I want to hopefully help you guys not have the same problem. So I first applied to law school back in 2007. And I went from my high school in San Diego to University of California, Los Angeles, and I graduated straight from UCLA. When I applied to law schools back then, this was back, by the way, in the dark days of mailing paper across the country. Things were different. And about a month later, I received a physical letter from LSAC telling me that I hadn't submitted a transcript from all of my institutions. And I kind of thought, well, what could I possibly be missing? I went straight to UCLA and I finished. And it turns out they had access to this situation in which during my senior year of high school, on my campus, as part of my regular schedule, I had taken a class that was technically considered community college level credit. That one semester of a political science class that I got an A in when I was 17 forced my application to be delayed by about 2 months in total. I had to go to the community college I'd never physically been to before, deal with their hot mess of a transcript office, and the whole process was a major detriment. So I say this as a warning. Make sure that when you compile your transcripts, you can think about every possible college level credit that is a part of your file. Your undergraduate schools, your community college, classes you may have taken for fun over the summer, right? Study abroad programs that were not a part of your institution. Just make sure you put all of that in there, because one of the worst parts of this process is thinking that you're ready to apply, but you're held up by administrative paperwork that hasn't yet been formalized. So just be very aware of all those integral elements of the transcript just to get that in early in your application process and hopefully be done with it and worry about focusing on the rest of the major elements. So your LSAT scores, everyone that you have that's currently valid, meaning within a 5-year period, the law schools are going to see, including the potential single or multiple writing samples. A question that somebody may be asking, do you have to or should you rewrite your writing sample with a retake of the exam? And the answer is basically no. Right? There is no need for that. If you felt like you did a very subpar job the first time, you could go back for redemption in round two. But as the writing sample is not scored as part of your LSAT score, it's not particularly important for the process. Likely it wouldn't be worth your trouble. So these are again reminiscent of all of the versions of a transcript that have to matter. Undergraduate, if you happen to have graduate experience, potentially you've already started law school and you're applying again to find a better situation, all of those have to be compiled as part of the process. Letters of recommendation, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a few pages here. And again, if you happen to have already started, false started, if you would, at another law school program, they're going to have to know the specifics about that situation. And so let's talk about the biggest of all the big pictures here. So here's the honest truth. One exam, which used to be back in the days of 5-section LSATs before the implementation of the flex tests, a 4-hour exam has more value for your law school admission than 4 years of college. Right? The LSAT is up to 70 or even higher % of the overall application package. So this is absolutely not the time to skimp. If you have a great GPA, do not sidestep into the LSAT thinking that you don't have to excel here. If you had a GPA that you don't think was maybe as good as it could have been, this is where your redemption comes. The LSAT is by far the most important part of the law school application process. Please always keep that in mind. And you have, as it says here, up to a 4 to 5 times heavier focus on LSAT over GPA. And essentially, as far as the relative rankings of your application elements, it goes in the first bracket of 2 measurements, LSAT significantly above GPA. And then significantly beneath those 2 functions is where you see the personal statement and letters of recommendation. But before I talk about the written elements, let's address just for a moment what's happened this year. So this has been an incredibly unfortunate year in so many ways for so many people. And it was a big detriment to people who were trying to apply to law school in the spring of 2020. When the pandemic happened and we're no longer allowed to be in groups, there were no longer offered LSAT administrations. The March exam was canceled, the April exam was canceled. As law schools, as businesses, which is what they are, began to panic, the Law School Admission Council had to innovate. And they had to implement something that they had made clear for a while they weren't really in a hurry to do. But ever since June of this year, they have implemented a remotely proctored exam called the LSAT Flex. And I saw somebody earlier kind of play into my heartstrings because I am a bit of an old school lo-fi dog myself. I like the tangible element of a paper and pencil test. That ship, my friends, has long since sailed. But the value of having the LSAT Flex versus the digitally administrated LSAT that's been around for the last 2 years or so, I personally think is huge. You get to take it at home, right, from the comfort of your own safety nest, right, your own best study environment. You know your computer, you know your Wi-Fi, you know your room, you put on your best executive sweatpants, and you get to work. But a major factor, again, as a bonus, the LSAT Flex only contains 3 sections. So you have but 3 35-minute sections to wrap up the entirety of your official LSAT exam. And so that includes 1 section of each of the 3 major types, 1 logical reasoning, 1 reading comprehension, and 1 section of the games or analytical reasoning. But in this last bullet point here, law schools have been told by the Law School Admission Council that the LSAT Flex is absolutely as valid and as worthy as a regular quote-unquote traditional LSAT score. And to be honest, the LSAT Flex is going to be in our lives for a while. Right? Nobody knows the answers to the big questions. When does life get back to normal? When do you have a chance to take tests in person again? Which is not normally what people are excited about, but it is an important part of this process. So for the foreseeable future, for the next several months at least, the LSAT Flex is the only opportunity to take the LSAT. Law schools are very aware of this, and they do not hold that against you. 2 identical scores in 2 different candidates. If somebody took a regular LSAT last year, has a 165, you took an LSAT Flex and got a 165, Neither of you are seen as preferential just because of the format of your exam. So if that's something that was giving you anxiety, please quell that immediately. Don't worry about that. The world knows that the world is crooked at the moment, and so this flex test is what we've got, and the law schools know that, and they're not going to hold it against you. But all things aside about the itty-bitty specifics of actually compiling your law school application, let's go broad. Let's go big and think about where are you going to send these applications to? So let's talk for a few minutes about the intangibles of where you want to apply to law school. And so many students, I personally think, put a kind of an unfair and inappropriate value on just the ranking of a school. And of course, the rankings of a law school are very important for job prospects, for later salary implications. It's a big deal. The better the school, typically the more attention you may receive in your career, yada, yada, yada. However, there are significant other factors that you have to consider as far as where do you want to live? Who do you want to be? Where would you be happy in dealing with the 3 years that are coming that are going to be 3 pretty hard years, right? If you don't think that you can handle the upstate New York winters, don't go to Cornell just because it's a few ranks higher than another school in a more temperate area where you feel more comfortable. So think about it. Really strongly consider, what are your priorities? What are you looking for? Right? Many students want to go to law school, earn their JD, and not necessarily practice law. Right? In truth, other than those 3 difficult years, there is very little disadvantage ever to having a law degree. It will open up an incredible amount of doors to an incredible range of opportunities. So please consider that, right? What do you want to do with your degree? Do you want to go to academia? Do you want to go to corporate law? Do you want to save the world? There are so many options out there, and what school you attend is a large factor in making those things happen. So what are your plans post-graduation? What makes you happy, right? Where do you have family? Where do you have areas you want to be in, right? Weather, sports teams for some people, lots of factors really ought to be considered. Social elements. Do you want to be in a big city? Are you comfortable? Do you feel safe in a big city? It's a major, major consideration. So let's talk about this. Based off of that very early rudimentary prognostications here of who may be a target school, let's talk about creating a very rough list of schools that meet that criteria. Geographic preferences, school size, classroom size, social environment, right? Did you go to a school for undergrad that was a smaller school, and now you want to go to a law school at a program that has a large undergraduate presence? Do you want to go to football games so people can do that again? Do you want to be a part of a very raw school spirit environment? Or do you want to just go to a place where you feel like you can focus on your law school studies and that's all you're going to need to worry about? Right? School size, social environment, financial requirements and needs. Law school can be a very expensive ordeal. You have to think very seriously about the investment you're putting into this and what the end game is going to be. And so from here, there's a lot of big issues, and money, let's be honest, is a big part of this process. So as we're going to talk about the next few slides, how many schools you actually send applications to does have to involve financial considerations. And so personal goals, including money, including life, love, pursuit of happiness, and the rest of it, and your skill sets, right? Where do you think you'd be the best asset to a program, and what program provides the best opportunities for you? So then, once you have your roster of potential targets here, research these schools. Use everything you can find online, right? Look at their websites. They're extensively created for this exact purpose. They know they're advertising themselves, so go read the advertisement, right? Check out what they specifically choose to highlight. It's a pretty good way to really see what direction a program's leaning by what they're focusing on their web pages. Are they really clearly working on public interest, right? Do they have a strong financial sector kind of an angle, right? Figure out what they're really portraying to the world and ask yourself, is that what interests you in this program, right? And again, of course, with the current state of the world, sadly, this generation for this particular round of applicants is very unlikely to get the opportunity to go to an in-person law forum or fair. And so there are, of course, amendments being made on both sides. Law schools are trying to innovate as best they can and create more Zoom opportunities, right? Town halls digitally, where you get a chance to speak to current and former students, professors, deans of admission, and really get a chance to put your name, maybe your face out there, and ask the key questions to make sure that you're not applying to a school where you're going to spend a lot of good years and a lot of money just because of the number of that school. You've got to think holistically about everything that's a part of the law school experience. So try to figure out maybe how to wean that list down a little bit and eliminate those that really do not seem to interest you. Then we're going to continue to whittle down that list until you really find a target area of applications where you believe that this presents your best net to cast around the schools, where one of them is going to be the one lucky enough to get you, and you feel like you can know with confidence this is where you're supposed to be. And so again, learning environment, class sizes. Some classes are very small, some are quite large. Same as an undergrad. You have some large lecture halls, some very small seminars. What kind of clinics do they offer? What kind of externship opportunities? What's their job placement? What is their relationship and standing with the community? So many factors that can be investigated. To be totally honest, so many of my students and my clients just don't. So it's a really important question to ask yourself. Where do you want to be? Who do you want to be? Where is the best place to turn you into that person you most want to become? And so as you continue to whittle that list down further and further, maybe perhaps go back for round two. Maybe you'll have better questions to ask at this point. You'll know more about what you like and what you don't to make those interactions with the heads of marketing, with the deans of admission, that much more effective. But then let's talk about the important part. Let's talk about this sort of trident of attacks here, right? You may have heard the phrase safety school. And so that's kind of a risky word because, to be honest, not everything is considered safe. Nothing's ever a guarantee. But I like the spread here we have of these three bullets. A few definite schools. Schools were based off of online ways to track your potential progress. And by the way, one of the most sort of established ones that's always been there is through the LSAC itself. Right? The LSAC website runs a program called the Index Calculator. And you can input your current or projected GPA and LSAT score, and it will tell you a rough percentage of admittance based off of the previous year's class. Here's the thing, though, about that site and sites like it. Those are pessimistic by design. They only know those two things, and there are still many other soft factors that can really supersede the hard numbers for a number of the applicants. So they don't know who you are. They don't know where your GPA came from. They don't know how many times you've taken the exam, all these other things that are major elements to who you present yourself to be in the application, but they do give you some legitimate numerical ranges. So I would call a quote-unquote definite school a school that projects at least, let's say, 90% likelihood of admittance. Likely schools, there's no set quantification here. Maybe schools where those kinds of sites and plannings project 65 to 75% or higher. And then a few maybe schools. If there is a school that you've always dreamed of, the only way to guarantee you don't get in is if you do not apply. Every year I have clients who are just shocked in the best possible way that a school that they had written off but had tried anyways for the dream has actually admitted them, and they are exactly where they wanted to be. So, of course, there is a long shot based off literal statistics. Low percentages mean likely low percentages, but shoot your shot. Go big. And also, to think about this, going back to my take on the fact that, especially now more than ever, financial considerations need to be high on everybody's list. And so applying to law school isn't free, and it's often not cheap, right? Some law schools will waive your admission fees, right? Your application fees. And a way actually potentially to encourage that is that there is something on the Law School Admission Council website, lsac.org, called the Candidate Referral Services. And maybe if John or Dave can throw a link in there for that, that allows you to fill out some demographic, geographic factors and basically click yes to allow schools to contact you. That might result in a flood of emails. You might get some junk, but you also might very likely get free application waivers. And so if it's a school that you were already planning on applying to, you just saved yourself $75. And if it's a school that you hadn't planned on applying to, maybe it's worth a consideration. In my mind, I don't think there's ever a reason to go through extended effort or spend money on applying to a school that you absolutely know you do not want to go to. However, if you're able to accrue some fee waivers, right, get to a point where you're not paying for the application and you don't have to add any extra materials, then what the heck? Sign up, put it out there. Every admittance can be useful, right? If you get into a school that you weren't really considering, you might potentially be able to leverage that and get off of a wait list to the school that you really want to go to. Scholarship negotiations are very possible in the spring, and your ability to say, well, I'm really pleased with this offer. However, I'm inclined to have to consider this other program that's either higher ranked or offers a better financial obligation. To perhaps, with tact and not being overly pushy or gauche about it, you might very well increase your scholarship offer by a lot. And so overall, basically likely what you did for undergrad, the ones where you're very, very likely, the ones where you find yourself reasonably likely, and the ones that are just doing it for the dream, the only way to guarantee you don't get in is if you don't actually apply. So let's talk about the important things. Starting early, right? Those of you guys here tonight, and I imagine many of you have plans to apply this term, you are by no means too late, right? Applications are now open at just about every single program. But like Dave was saying earlier, it doesn't mean that you're in a major disadvantage for not applying for the next couple of months. Some easy ways to get started in the process is to get into this website, lsac.org. And if you haven't taken the LSAT yet, that has to be the most pressing obligation. Not rushing into it just to do it, but planning on when you're going to find your best possible LSAT scores. And on that website, again, is where you register for the CAS, the Credential Assembly Services. Both of those things you can do at any point, and both of them allow for extended access. That Credential Assembly Services account is good for several years. So if you end up not applying this year, your LSAT score wasn't what you wanted, that application material compilation stays active. Your letters of recommendation will stay on file. Your transcripts will stay on file. So if you want an early win in the process, go to the website tonight and sign up. It's not free. None of this is. But it's important to consider yourself into what you can do to minimize the stress and maximize taking care of some of the busy work earlier rather than later. This is the thing that I think, by the way, is the most pressing obligation. I was talking to somebody earlier, and I kind of got lost in the names, perhaps Grayson or Brandon maybe, and I was recommending that your focus should be pretty much exclusively on LSAT until you take the test. Then maybe in those few weeks as you wait for your score to come back, you can then kill some of the anxiety and fill the time by working on your application materials. However, you do not want to be in the very undesirable position where you are ready to go and you don't have your letters of recommendation. You want to give your letter writers at least a month's notice, right? Be persistent but not pushy with your reminders. Give them as much as you can as useful fodder to be able to create a specific, a meaningful, and a detailed letter of recommendation. And somebody else I was talking to earlier in the chat, it's not a name-dropping contest. If you have a teacher who knows you very well and a prestigious figure, say the dean or the head of the department who doesn't know you very well, you always pick the source that allows for the most personal, specific, I don't know if it's always to be heartfelt, but really meaningful, really detailed letter of recommendation. Because once they submit to LSAC through that CAS process, it might still take up to a week or more to process. So just plan for that, right? Be early and be organized. The actual applications are probably the easiest part of all of this, because what really matters are the attachments and the submissions. Your personal statement, diversity statement, transcripts, resumes, letters of rec. But the applications are mostly just fill in the blank stuff, mostly just checking boxes on biographical background information. You can start those today. You can open the application, right? As you create it, some people are always worried about applying prematurely, but you can't apply for one until all of your applications complete, including LSAT, letters of rec, and the rest of it. They're also not going to let you apply until you pay them. So it would be very difficult to accidentally apply prematurely. So open them up, see specifically what they ask for and what you're going to have to tackle just to get ahead of these later missions. A resume, as Dave was saying, is incredibly important. It helps them understand things about you that they might not directly see in your transcripts. And a law school resume certainly has some subtle but significant tweaks from your maybe professional resume. Education is the focus, right? Really highlight relevant coursework, programs, honors, scholarships, activities, extracurriculars. Those of you who have the benefit of still being in school and potentially have the opportunity to create some of those elements if you don't currently have them, take that advantage. Join that club, run for that position, do something to really highlight the kind of student you are, not just inside, but outside of the classroom. So extracurriculars and leadership, right? Greek system, even though it's not the biggest deal, but other clubs on campus, your volunteering opportunities, professional things should certainly still be listed, as I know many of us are potentially several years away from your undergrad. So highlight what makes you feel like not the best employee, but the best student, right? Leadership abilities, comprehension, discipline, ability to handle multifarious and very overwhelming schedules, right? So think about that resume. As Dave said, it'd be pretty rare to want or need a 2-page version, but I make sure that you hit them hard with the things that matter. You're not applying to a job, you're applying to a school. And we talked about this a little bit earlier. The transcripts here are a very crucial and clearly mandatory part of the process. Most people may not have that kind of aberration in the scare that I did of a totally unforeseen, completely forgotten about community college class in high school. But do that early because, again, even that takes some time to process once within the LSAT system. And then we have, of course, here the big picture that most people are here to be informed about, to be curious about. And earlier, there was a couple of postings of that link to the personal statement webinar that David recorded and is on a Vimeo site, I believe. That's an amazing resource. That gives you, for free, all of the incredibly detailed information that we just don't have a lot of time for tonight. But in a very short few minutes here, this is your job. You are trying to do everything you can to be more than just a name and numbers. They need to be told things about you that they otherwise would not know. The key things, as sort of trite but true as this is, you have to show them things about you. You do not tell them. Right? I worked with a student years ago who was the most amazing sweetheart, who had undergone just absolutely every awful thing that life could throw her. Right? Broken home, there was abuse in the house. It was really a very difficult environment. She had put herself through school. She had raised her younger siblings. She was an absolute inspiration, and she was going to be headed to a number of scholarships. But her first draft of the personal statement she had sent me was just bad. And she's a good friend of mine. I told her to face, this is not great. Because her first statements were something like, I have had a very hard life, period. We grew up poor, period. You can't just say things like that. You have to show them things. And I can't recall exactly now, this was honestly about 15 years ago, but our worked on first sentence was something much more compelling along the lines of, I woke up before dawn to the sound of broken glass again. I guess dad's back out of jail, which is clearly a heavy opener. But my thinking is that if your readers of this in the schools that you're applying to aren't willing to spend $1 to finish your essay after reading the first sentence, you didn't start strongly enough. Do not start in the first paragraph. I have always wanted to go to law school because blank. People think I'm good at debating. I like to argue. I'm a really big Legally Blonde fan. That is a guaranteed way to have them not care about you far too quickly. So think about what it is that makes you you. And I realize people feel very undergunned when you realize there are people applying with life experiences that you don't have. But that's okay, right? Like Dave was saying earlier, I love that analogy. You can't have an entire team of just one position. Right? You need people of all walks of life, and we really do mean all walks of life. So you have to figure out not just writing about why you want to go to law school, but write about your world. Write about how you see what's going on. Talk about what has happened to you, by you, or around you that has shaped your worldview, inspired you to be the person you are, and helps to glimmer, at least, to hint at a glimmer of who you're going to be as a student and what you're going to be able to do in your professional and personal future to reflect well on this program. So very likely, your core essay is going to be pretty ubiquitous in the one that you send to every program. right? Some schools will have varying length limitations. My local school, I live in Orange County, California, UCI has a rather Spartan limitation. They cut off your personal statement at 500 words. And that's grim. That's short. That's about a page and a quarter double space, as they all have to be. Some schools allow no limitations whatsoever. But the idea is, if you don't think you have a life story worth making somebody read 4 pages about, don't write 4 pages, right? The typical industry standard is about 2 pages, double spaced, 12-point font. Gets you about 5, maybe 4, 6 paragraphs to open with some kind of hook, bring them into the story. Talk about your life as it progresses chronologically. Talk about something in a way that you want to be interesting. You don't have to be insanely dramatic. You don't have to be funny or completely, utterly unique. Be yourself, because you're great and that's what they want to know about. You have to show them the things they cannot see from your hard numbers. And so maybe you're submitting some with, a small school-specific tweak at the bottom, but likely a lot of those times those feel very disingenuous. To have a personal statement and then say at the bottom, and that's why I can't wait to go to blank school. If that's all you're going to do, it might be best to just not do that. But highlight the story about you. You are the story, and keep it that way. So this is an incredibly important point, because I, in looking at this earlier, wanted to say the phrase double check, and here it is right here, because we mean this, right? You are going into a profession that is all about following the rules. So follow the damn rules. If they tell you it's a strict 2-page limit on the personal statement, that is a strict limit. Do not submit more addenda than they allow. Do not try to submit more letters of recommendation that they allow. Do not violate their ordinances on how and for how long are you going to write this personal statement. So double, triple check everything. And like Dave said earlier, optional doesn't really mean optional. For most every case, optional means compulsory. Do it. They offered you the opportunity to show them that you're going to go above and beyond, so you should do precisely that. Everything then is uploaded onto your LSAT account. Then you can go through within each individual application and really, truly double check it. Right? Make sure everything is there the way it's supposed to be. And then finally, do you pay the man? Right? As you submit your money to the LSAC site, your law school applications will be sent out, and then the waiting game starts. Try your best to distract yourself, because it might be a long time, right? Sometimes I had a student or a client a year ago. He got his application into UCLA by the end of September. He got a phone call from Dean Guerrero, and he was admitted within a week. And so there is an opportunity here to maybe get in early and hopefully have some good news, but likely you might not know where you're going until late spring. So try your best to stay distracted. This year has made it easy to do that, not always in the best ways, but the best that thing you can do to really, truly put yourself in the best possible place for your future, follow the rules, do everything specifically, do it as best as you possibly can, as timely as you can, once everything's been perfected, and then put it in somebody else's hands and hope for the best. So thank you guys for letting me chat at you tonight. I'll be here on the chat box still. I do work at PowerScore both as an LSAT tutor and instructor and an admissions consultant. And if I could ever be of service to you guys later, I would love to chat further about that. But for now, I'm going to send you back to the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Dave Kaloran. It is all yours.
Thanks, Jay. I appreciate that. And you can see how good Jay is from that section, where he covered so much ground, but so well and so succinctly. Fantastic job there. I get the enviable task here of talking about some of the specifics of the end of the process in terms of applications. Jay just gave us a fantastic overview of how everything works together and all the big pieces. And so now I'm going to talk about some of the things that don't apply to everybody, but tend to apply to a lot of people. And already in the chat that I was just engaged in, I saw people asking things about like non-traditional applications and so forth. We're going to go through some of that here. So I'm going to start off with the idea of early decision versus early action. Now, when it comes to most applicants, what you find is that they go through what's known as regular decision, which means they apply, nothing special. They go through the process. They get their decision sometime in the spring, typically of the year, and that's it. But there are certain options that you can take, especially if you are applying early. And these two are the most commonly known ones. And one of these is far more important than the other because of some of the restrictions that it places upon you. So let's start off with that one, and that is early decision, which is also quite regrettably known as ED. So you end up saying that, yeah, you're going ED or you have ED, what have you. It's not a great look for the law school process, but that's just the way that it is. And what it means is that you are applying early with the idea that I'm going to apply by a very early certain deadline. I'm going to get an early decision. And that sounds like a great thing, doesn't it? You're like, apply early, find out early. I might know by the time the holidays roll around whether or not I'm in at the school of my choice. But there is a big downside to that, and that is that typically with early decision, it is a binding decision. And that means that if you are accepted, you have to withdraw all other applications. At a lot of schools, you can only apply to one school early decision. Not all of them, however. So read the rules and guidelines very carefully. As Jay just said, you don't want to violate any of their ordinances, so don't break the rules. But typically, you can apply to one school, but it's kind of like this is your mating for life. They're saying if we decide that we're going to take you as a student, you're done. You are now going to our school. This is your decision. And they will make you sign a separate statement and send it into them that is a binding contract. If you try to break that contract, they will simply let all the other law schools know that you've done that and keep you out. So it is a big, big decision. So here's the question. Why would someone get themselves into early decision? Why would you go make that choice? Well, there's a couple different scenarios that kind of play into this. First off, for some people, there are dream schools. You may know that there's a school that you really want to go to, and consequently, you're going to go ahead and apply there. And if you get in, no matter what the circumstances, you know you'd be going. All right, that's a great example of a school where early decision could make some sense. Another reason that someone might apply early decision is they feel really good about the school, and also they don't care about money or debt. Obviously, that is a rare situation to be in, but for some people, they're like, okay, I don't care. And we'll talk about why that's an important consideration in just a moment. And then for other people, they might be applying, it's a school they really want to go to, but they don't think they're quite good enough, and they think that applying early decision can give them a bump, kind of like a boost to their application, check an extra box. It can. So let's talk a little bit about that, because the way this process works is really interesting. When you apply early decision, you are telling the law school, I love you. I want to be with you forever. And the law school appreciates that. They see that it is a box that gets checked. It is a real positive. So the question is why doesn't everybody apply early decision? Well, not everybody knows where they want to apply to go to school. But one of the big downsides is this. Is if you are accepted early decision, you lose all your ability to negotiate financially with the school. If they don't offer you enough money to attend, you're out of luck. You can't go and apply to another school because you committed to that school. And so while there's a big benefit of getting your answer early and having this positive boost to your application, the big downside is that if money is a consideration, and it is for almost everybody I know, you have put yourself in a position where you can't negotiate. If you went out and got a higher LSAT score that all of a sudden would have qualified you for a full ride at a lot of schools, if you went early decision, you're out of luck. So that's where we start running into problems. You have to balance what your needs are, what your financial situation is. And for a lot of people, the financial problems in terms of like you can't negotiate means that they don't want to go early decision. Now, there's another downside to it as well, and that comes down in the second bullet point. If you were denied admission during the early decision process, you're done at that school for the year. You typically cannot then reapply for the regular decision. There is a kind of an exception to that, and that is that at some schools, they will write you back and say, look, we really can't make a decision, or we're not going to give you a positive decision on early decision. We want to move you into the regular decision pool. And most people are like, I'll do whatever, go right ahead. The nice thing there is if you did apply early decision, it stays with you. Because later on, when they're looking at that end decision or you're on the wait list or wherever you may actually be, they go back and they say, this person really did want to come here. And Jay and I were talking earlier today about the idea that yield protection in law schools is a real concept and it has an impact. And sometimes schools will say, we're not sure you're going here. We're not going to accept you. Sometimes we'll just outright deny you if we don't think you're going to come here. When you apply early decision, you're telling that school, oh, I'll go there. So that can be a real positive. So if you're sitting in a position where you're thinking about this, debate all those elements. The boost you get to your application, the early application decision, the bump it can provide you throughout the entire process versus the fact that you lose the financial ability to negotiate and you're locking in your choice. There's no other pathway through. So we've got that. There's another type of program out there that's very similar. It is called Early Action. And this is EA. So if you're a gamer, EA Sports. This is a kind of like baby version of early decision. You still get everything in early. You still get an early result. The difference is this. Usually it's non-binding. So early action, sometimes you see it called priority track. There's different names for it out there. But as you go through this, it doesn't have that binding element, and that often lowers what is actually occurring in terms of like the severity of outcomes. It's much more relaxed. For a lot of people, early action, if they can get to it, they like to do it because it gives them options. So those are outside the regular track of applications that you're going, and they require you to take special steps and sign special documents, but they are options that you will see mentioned throughout this process, so it is worth understanding. Let's talk about some special situations for applicants. And in some respects, I often say to people, like, there is no normal. Nobody's really normal anyway. There's no such thing as a normal applicant. Almost everybody has some kind of difference from what is considered the base applicant. So I want to talk about 3 different types of applicants. The first one of my favorites, splitters. And there's not just splitters. There's reverse splitters. There's also super splitters and super reverse splitters. So let's talk about what a splitter actually is referring to and how people who are splitters tend to fare in the process. So you can see the definition right here at the top of the screen. A splitter is someone who has LSAT and GPA numbers that are split between high and low. So one of them's high and one of them is low. And what is used to determine the high and low numbers at each school are the medians. Not the exact 50th percentile median, but the 25th and 75th percentile medians. So when we look at, I just pulled Georgetown out as an example for tonight. Their LSAT percentiles are 161 and 167 at the 25th and 75th percentile. Their GPA, 347 and 385. So if you were a student and you had a relatively low GPA, and I laugh when I say relatively low because my GPA when I graduated Duke was lower than 347. So no apologies there. I had a lot of fun while I was in school. So if you had a GPA lower than 347 and you were applying to Georgetown, and you had an LSAT above 167, you would actually be a splitter. So you'd exceed the number 167, and you would be below the 347 there. So when I look at that, that's what a splitter is. A reverse splitter would have the lower LSAT score and the higher GPA. And then super splitters would have their numbers even more exaggerated in whichever direction we were talking about. Now, a lot of times, we'll focus on splitters for a second. When splitters come into the process, they're very fearful. They're like, well, my LSAT looks great, but my GPA is going to hold me back. They're not wrong, but you have to remember that in the process of kind of like compiling a law school class, someone who has a really high LSAT score, and that's over the 75th percentile, is actually very useful to law schools because they're going to have someone else out there who has a perfect GPA, but who doesn't have a great LSAT score. And when they pair those two people together, they make two very typical applicants. And so, depending upon the class year and the cycle that we're going through, sometimes splitters and reverse splitters can have tremendous results. And so, as we get into this, you can look at certain cycles and discover all of a sudden that splitters did just as well as a lot of the regular applicants. And so did reverse splitters because they formed the team that I was talking about, and they were able to match applicants and pair them off and kind of offset each of these numbers. As I always tell people, the splitter is in a slightly better position than the reverse splitter. So having the high LSAT score is more desirable than having the higher GPA. And the reason for that is as follows. There are fewer high LSAT scores than there are high GPAs. So as you go through this, if you fall into one of these categories, don't give up. Yeah, maybe it'll make your wait a little bit longer. Maybe some schools will, not be as thrilled, but there will be schools out there who say, oh, I'm okay with you having a GPA that's lower than our 25th or an LSAT that's lower than our 25th, especially if you have that offset on the other side, because they can use that to their advantage when assembling the class. We got a great blog article that explains it a little bit further in terms of what splitters are and how it can affect your application chances and so forth. But that's a decent overview. So if you're in that pool, don't give up hope. Let's go to the next group that's in a special situation, commonly known as ERMs, or underrepresented minorities in the law school process. And again, you can see the definition up top here. This refers to a group of students whose racial or ethnic population in law school is less than that of the general population. And then we've got kind of a brief list of groups that are typically considered ERMs. And it changes a little bit school by school. So it's not some type of absolute list. But when we take a look at what's happening here, we talked earlier about the idea of diversity and how law schools like to have diverse classes. And that could be religion, it could be politics, it could be geography, it could be age, it could be all these different things. Well, obviously, racial diversity is something that they want to have in the classroom and should have in the classroom. And so they're focused on this as an element. And oftentimes what you see is that if you come in an underrepresented minority group, it gives you a solid boost in terms of your application chances. It's kind of like checking off several boxes at once for the law schools. And so when you look at the numbers, you really want to think about a law school not so much as these are the numbers, but how do these numbers affect me? And typically with underrepresented minorities, they get enough of a boost where they could come in a little bit lower and still do very well in terms of their admissions chances. So the effect it has is typically a big positive. Interesting question though, why are some groups considered ERMs and others aren't? It's very simple. It's about representation. There are some groups that are ethnic minorities in the United States, but who are not minorities when it comes to, say, law school representation. And those groups do not get that boost. And sometimes from school to school, it really changes. I think, again, Jay and I were talking about this webinar earlier today. I was talking to him about Hawaiian Pacific Islanders and how for a lot of schools on the mainland US, they do fall into kind of like an underrepresented group and they can get a boost. But if you look at the University of Hawaii, they most assuredly do not because they're in Hawaii. So they've got plenty of applicants from the local area. So sometimes there's going to be a little bit of a change. And the groups that we have listed there are what are popularly or typically considered to fall into this categorization. And if you're thinking, I'm not sure where I fit in this entire process, talk to the schools that you're looking at. Because the University of Washington might have a very different view of what they're looking for in their class than, say, the University of Alabama. So talk to the schools and see what they can tell you about what they are looking for in students, because each school has diversity goals that are different from the school next to them. And so knowing what they're thinking can give you a sense of, I might have a pretty good chance at this school. And that might allow you to apply to someplace where you might not have initially thought that you were going to apply. Let's move on to what is going to be the last group that we talk about here tonight. And that is something that I've seen in chat already: non-traditional students. Now, this is my favorite part when we talk about the whole assembly of a team. Typical law student is in their mid-20s. They're usually right out of college. They just graduated last year or within the last couple of years, and so they're new to the workforce. So-called non-trad students aren't in that group. They're usually older. They're typically over 30. Sometimes they're 40, 50. I've worked with students into their 70s before. And a lot of times they have really much longer resumes. And so one of the questions that I saw come up a lot was, does my resume really have to be one page? Yes, please try to keep it to one page. You've got to have a really deep and robust work history to go past one page, even for law schools, because you're looking at some professor who doesn't have much time, who's glancing at your resume saying, who is this person? They don't want to flip it over to a second page. They want to say, oh, went to this school, okay, did well here, LSAT's this. Yeah, everything needs to be on that resume page in a glance, even if it is replicated elsewhere, such as your GPA or LSAT score on your law school report. So, as we take a look at non-trad students, a lot of times people come to me when they're a little bit older and they say, I know I'm at a disadvantage. And I'm always happy to report, no, you are not. You're actually in an advantageous position. Why? Because you're different. If the typical law student is 25, 26, 27, and you're 43, well, guess what? You now bring an entirely different viewpoint into the classroom. You've got a much longer work history, and you can bring all that work-related knowledge into the classroom. You might be married. You might have a family. All these dimensions make you different compared to the average law student. And so when someone says, does being older hurt your law school candidacy? No, it doesn't. Even if you're 65 and the law school might be like, what's this person doing? They're still going to admire the fact that you're 65 and you're like, I've got the gumption to go back to law school. Sidebar question comes up. What about me having a family? I got this question a lot in the last couple of weeks for some reason, where people had said to me, I've got 2 kids or I've got 3 kids. Are law schools going to hold it against me because they know that I'm going to be distracted? And my first response was no. And then I was like, wait, are they? So that I called a few of my law school contacts and asked them this question. And their response was, I've never been asked that before. I've never even thought about that when I'm reading essays. And I was like, okay, good. I was pretty sure I was on base, but sometimes you have to stop and think and just make sure. They're not worried about it. And the reason is you're an adult. They know that you can prioritize. If they have accepted you into the law school, they have convinced themselves that you are in a position where you can succeed. That's all that matters to them. If they think you can do it, they can look at your work history, your organizational abilities, all the things you've done in your life and say, this person can certainly fit law school into having a family. I will say that it will be more of a challenge for you as a student because kids can be distracting. And sometimes they just want your attention. But that's okay. Everybody builds their schedule differently, and as long as you know that going in, you can adjust for that particular fact. So, as we kind of go through this and we look at some of these groups here at the end, splitters, underrepresented minorities, non-traditional students, they all have different aspects. And it's not that it disadvantages people who aren't in those groups. It's just that sometimes when we're building the team, I might need a wide receiver for the team, and that person's the wide receiver. Other people aren't disadvantaged by not being wide receivers. They have different traits. Maybe next time I need a quarterback when I'm selecting students. So it is not about somebody was disadvantaged or somebody was advantaged. It was more about what does the school actually need. And that's a really, really important point to consider as you go through this, because it means that no matter who you are unique, obviously. You have experiences nobody else has. Play those up in your application. Make yourself and present yourself as somebody who can add to the discussion, somebody that they want to sit next to, somebody they'd be interested in talking to. If you're able to do that, you will be an extremely successful law school applicant, because those elements, those aspects play such a big role in this process. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a really good sense of not just the whole overview of the timeline and the various elements, the groups that you're going to have to work with from LSAC to CAS and so forth, but some of the things to consider when you're looking at things like personal statements and what type of applicant you actually are. So that brings us pretty much to the end of the content. What we're going to do now is I'm going to make a few additional comments about how to get a hold of us, and then I'm going to open up the floor to any questions that people have, and then Jay or myself will jump on the microphone and answer those as we're able to. So one thing I do want to point out to everybody is that there's a pandemic going on. I'm not sure anyone has noticed aside from myself, but if you hadn't noticed, because of the fact that everyone is stuck at home, we've been running our Stuck at Home sale for quite a while now, and I have said a few times on our podcast that I'm not going to stop the sale until the pandemic at least is under some degree of control, which might not be till 2024 at this point. But we're doing this because we know people can't get out. We know that it's a difficult situation to study for these tests, and we're trying to make it easier on everybody. And so we've put big discounts, the biggest discounts I've ever seen us put on various courses, on tutoring, on our books as well. So if you are thinking about taking the LSAT, or you need tutoring or taking a course, something like that, please check into that. That is ongoing. I hope it ends sooner as opposed to later. It's the easiest way for me to put it because I want this pandemic to end. However, it is there right now if you are considering working with us, and hopefully you are. And if you need more information or if you want to talk to somebody in more detail about all of this, give us a call, send us an email, visit our website. These are easy ways to get in contact with us. We're always happy to help. There are numerous ways to get in contact with all of us. John and I are on Twitter. PowerScore's got a Twitter account. We're on Instagram, on Facebook. All the typical social channels are out there. You can access our podcast. I will post the link for that. We've got blogs out there. We've got a forum where we answer LSAT questions, both broad and specific, on a daily basis. So if you need help, we are there to back you. We are happy to assist. And as those of you who have seen me on Twitter or on the podcast know, I love the LSAT. I love helping people. Everybody who works here feels exactly the same way. So please feel free to reach out to us. So on that note, I'm going to stop the recording for the night, but please feel free to post any questions and we'll try to answer those in the post-seminar discussion. Thanks so much, everybody, for being here. Take care of yourselves out there, and please stay safe.